And with us this morning is a guy who, I don't know if he ever gets on vacation too much. He's Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, and the Senate back in session this week. Good morning, Senator. How are you?
Good morning, Gary. I'm fine. How are you?
Good. Have you had any chance to get any vacation this summer at all, or has this been kind of the never-ending session?
Yeah, my family and I got away for a 2-week vacation, and we enjoyed it very much.
Oh, well, good. Well, glad to hear that. Anyway, you get back to session today in Washington, and, you know, some governors and state lawmakers are urging action on proposals that could provide hundreds of billions of additional dollars to states and local governments as a result of this whole COVID pandemic. What's your take on all that? Where's that going, and do we see any solution in sight?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea for federal taxpayers to bail out states. And let's be honest, there's a lot of states that have been operating as a fiscal train wreck for years. Why should taxpayers in responsible areas be sending their money to bail out these big, bloated, inefficient, massive bureaucracies that are burning up money like nobody's business? I don't think that makes sense. And by the way, we already sent over $500 billion to states. It's a tremendous amount of money. Many states are still sitting on it. There's $1 billion in Harrisburg that has not been allocated yet among the counties and the cities. And by the way, there are states that have surpluses. There are states that have had no adverse effect budgetarily. They run a tight ship. They've got a budget surplus. They've got a rainy day fund. There are states where coronavirus barely showed up and they took no loss of revenue. So it's hard for me to see how we should send boatloads of money to, say, New York and Illinois that are fundamentally insolvent, even though they may be limping along from day to day. Their problems clearly predate the COVID crisis.
Well, let me ask you this question. Let's zero in on our state, Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And how is $1 billion still lying there that should be going out to people if we are hurting? I mean, there are a lot of people. I look around our area, a lot of people out of jobs. You were in New York here the other week. You've seen some of this stuff happen. Why is that $1 billion sitting there in the state right now?
That's a fair question, but in fairness to this whole agreement, I think, between the legislature and the governor on this, it is reasonable to expect that the restrictions on how that money can be spent are going to be loosened. Okay. So initially when we passed the CARES Act and allocated all this money, we thought, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll fully reimburse states and municipalities for any COVID-related expenses. And we ended up sending out more money than they could possibly spend on COVID-related expenses. And now they're expecting, and it's not without cause, they're expecting that we're going to relieve them of those limitations and allow that money to be used to basically just replace lost revenue, irrespective of how it gets spent. So in anticipation of that, they've sat back on some of this money, and I understand that, but the point is, it's still there. It's still there, and it's going to be allocated at some point soon.
One of the things that has been a stickling point, obviously, and in the Senate and also in the House and throughout other places in the country that are kind of sitting back watching what you all are going to do, has been the idea of liability. And you know, when it comes to fans in the stands, be it on a national level at pro sports or college sports or even here in local high school sports, if you go back there with fans and something happens, are you going to be liable as a school district, as an NFL owner, as a college that is hosting a football game on your campus, whatever it might be? Where do we stand on that whole liability factor? Because that doesn't seem to be moving anywhere right now.
Well, it's very, very important to me and to my Republican colleagues. Let's step back for a minute. You know, we've had a flu come through, especially in the wintertime, every year since, for centuries? Right. And I'm not aware of an annual wave of lawsuits being filed against businesses because their workers or customers contracted the flu and they say they got it at the workplace. That's never been a risk that we've had to contend with. Well, let me tell you, there's an industry of trial lawyers that would like to create that liability with respect to COVID. And I think that's a really bad development. So I think we ought to pass national legislation that says if you are in compliance with standard CDC guidelines, to keep workers and customers safe, you shouldn't have to worry about being subject to these lawsuits. So that's what we're trying to achieve. Our Democratic colleagues, of course, want no legal liability protection at all. And we're trying to see if we can work this out, but haven't been able to so far.
You know, it's kind of scary to me to think that the trial lawyers who would push for this kind of thing don't understand how dangerous it can be and how widespread that kind of attitude could become. That's a frightening aspect to me, that they don't have any idea of the accountability that maybe they have to have in terms of making sure this doesn't go forward in such a pell-mell fashion.
Yeah, well, I assure you they don't look at it that way. This is an opportunity to make a lot of money, and that's going to be an unfortunate motivator if we don't have proper legal protections in place.
As you go around the state, as you talk to people around the state and around the country, what are the major issues right now that people are talking about? And it sounds like a very simple question, and yet I say that with a little bit more depth to it, in the sense that the economy normally is what we're talking about, and obviously COVID has affected our economy greatly. And yet we also are seeing the unrest in our country at the moment. The Black Lives Matter movement, we're seeing what's happening in Portland on a regular basis, in other states, in other cities, with some of the riots that are going on. And people have become... I just talked to a guy the other day, and the guy said, you know what, for the first time ever, I'm thinking about buying a gun to protect my home. He said, I never thought about that. And you're starting to get people who are looking at this and saying, is this a new kind of America? What are your thoughts about that, Senator Toomey?
Well, you know, I've spent most of August traveling all over Pennsylvania and meeting with people from all walks of life. And you're right, one of the first topics of conversation that comes up everywhere is the intersection of COVID-19 and an economic recovery, right? So it's, how do we restore confidence? How do we keep people safe? How are we doing on testing? When are we going to have a vaccine? You know, the reopening, which has been very problematic in Pennsylvania, but, you know, we've made some progress. So there's that whole range of topics, and boy, there's a lot there. And then, as you point out, right, social unrest. And I will say one of the things that comes up repeatedly is the shock and dismay that elected officials, mayors typically, sometimes governors too, have been willing to tolerate violence, as though they don't have a responsibility to protect their constituents, to allow rioters to rampage, to allow the violence, the destruction of property, the threatening of lives is unbelievable. It's unbelievable to me. And I heard that every day across Pennsylvania.
And I think that's the biggest thing, is that we're pandering to a group. Listen, where there is injustice, where there is racism, shouldn't we be jumping on that and pouncing on that? Of course we should. But there are also people who are saying, but we ought not water down our standards to the point where we say, well, this is acceptable. You know, we kind of have to look the other way because people are a little upset and so forth. No, I think most Americans, I don't care if you're Republican or Democratic, conservative or liberal, would say, no, there have to be some standards of decency. Final thoughts from your particular standpoint.
Yeah, no, look, I couldn't agree more. I would defend anybody's right to a peaceful protest, whether
Absolutely.
I agree with them or not. And there's a lot I don't agree with in some of the peaceful protests. But it is never acceptable to engage in violence. That is not acceptable, and it is not acceptable for elected officials who have responsibility to abrogate that responsibility and decide, oh, we're going to have a summer of love. Oh, we're going to let people just, vent some steam. That is not acceptable.
Well, especially for chief executives of states whose job it is to execute the laws that have been passed to make sure that law-abiding citizens are protected in the state of Pennsylvania as well as around the country. Senator, we appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you so much. Good luck in the opening session, short though it may be, of Congress this week, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
Thank you. Senator Pat Toomey, Pennsylvania, here on WSBA.